If ever there was a match made in heaven or a marriage made in hell, it was surely that between William Blake and the Surrealists. Surrealism developed during the First World War and grew out of other movements such as Dadaism, which responded with derision and horror to the events of the First World War. The Surrealists as a group developed in the 1920s around the work of André Breton, who first wrote his manifestos of Surrealism, although it should be noted there were alternative groups claiming the title. Visual artists including Giorgio de Chirico, Max Ernst, Francis Picabia, Salvador Dali, Louis Brunel and others joined in. All of them were committed to the idea that the work of Sigmund Freud, which had explored the role of the unconscious particularly through dreams and free association, was a way of exploring the full depths of the mind. In terms of this, they created some of the most astonishing works of art in 20th century visual culture. And it's no surprise then to find that they in turn had looked to William Blake as one of their precursors. In this episode of Visionary, we'll explore in more detail some of the connections between William Blake and the Surrealist movement. Surrealism, the artistic movement that combined intense visionary experiences with a profound understanding of depth psychology, would seem to be the natural home of William Blake in the 20th century. The Surrealist commitment to the imagination and a rejection of the rational madness that ended in the horrors of the First World War, as expressed in the poetry of André Breton, Paul Eluard and Pierre Reverdy, as well as the dreamscapes of Max Ernst, André Masson and Salvador Dali, made them the obvious inheritors of Blake's revelations. André Breton included Blake as one of the precursors of the Surrealist movement, and thought by contrast that the realistic tradition of 19th century academic painting was hostile to any intellectual or moral advancement. Breton twice referred to Blake as a precursor to Surrealism, including in his essay Originality and Freedom, where Blake is numbered as one of the explorers, with other writers such as Novalis, Edgar Allan Poe and Baudelaire, who traversed to the further shores of the imagination. Blake is invoked in a very different context in the earlier piece Revolution Now and Forever, a document written as a response to the Moroccan War, in which Blake's political and philosophical values are foregrounded rather than his aesthetics. Here he is listed with Nietzsche, Marx, Kant, Spinoza and others as the beginning of capitalism's downfall. In the manifestos of Surrealism, Breton argued against the absolute rule of logic, and his call to unfurl the flag of imagination repeated many of the demands of key romantics, such as Blake and Percy Bysshe Shelley. An early commentator on the Surrealists, Anna Balakian, remarked that many Surrealists opposed the realistic style of much Romantic era painting in Europe, but that Blake was one exception held by them in high regard. She described William Blake as one of the earliest of the spiritual forebears of the Surrealists, but not the Blake who expressed himself through Christian symbols. Rather, the Surrealists saw Blake as a visionary whose artistic expression transformed rather than simply represented the world. For the Surrealists then, Blake was an example of the complete artist. While they viewed most romantic art as passé, it could still offer an example of revolt against bourgeois rationalism. Blake stood apart from these bourgeois romantics himself because of the extreme visions that he himself had witnessed during his lifetime. In the Anglo-American world, figures such as Ruth Van Todd combined an interest in Blake with new developments in modernism. Todd had been educated at Edinburgh School of Art and experimented in replicating Blake's technique with the printmaker Stanley Hayter and the Spanish surrealist Yo Miro in 1948. Hayter had worked hard to revitalise engraving as a means of modernist expression. He wrote admiringly of William Blake's skills as an engraver and, with Todd and Miro, expressed particular admiration for the large colour prints that were acquired by Tate Gallery in the early 20th century. It was at the International Surrealist exhibition in 1936, at the New Burlington Gallery in London, that Blake and the Surrealists came together. There were some 390 exhibits there, including work by Henry Moore, Paul Nash, Salvador Dali and Max Ernst. During its 3-week run, the exhibition attracted over 23,000 visitors. One contributor, Herbert Reed, sought to connect Surrealism to Romanticism, in particular the work of Blake, who was a great influence on Reed's own writings. Among the major Surrealist artists, an intriguing figure is Max Ernst. Although he does not write much about Blake in the same way that Breton does, he did make explicit use of some of Blake's images in his collage novel, La Femme sans tête, The 100 Headless Women. Ernst used the title page of Blake's engraving to Robert Blair's The Grave, showing a naked upside-down figure blowing a trumpet to announce the end of the world. Ernst created this graphic novel in 1929, cutting and pasting together excerpts from popular woodcuts and engravings. In 1942, for an article in View magazine devoted to his work, Ernst also listed William Blake as one of the most important painters who had influenced his work. Although he did not write about this in detail, one such area of influence may have been in terms of Ernst's own practice of the technique known as decalcomania, the practice of transferring ink or paint from a surface such as board or glass onto paper. This was a favourite of the Surrealists, with Breton and Yves Tanguy experimenting with the process as well as Ernst, because it created shapes and formations that could not be predicted and so, they argued, better demonstrated the workings of the unconscious. It was Ernst who demonstrated most mastery in decalcomania, particularly in paintings such as Europe After the Rain. Looking at the rock formations of that image, one cannot help but think of similar rocks that appear in Blake's depiction of Newton. And when Ernst created his stunning image during the Second World War, he would have been aware of the experimental work of Hayter, Todd and Miro, who were already beginning their experimentations and then would discuss how Blake quickly added pigments to millboard for his 1795 prints, before placing paper on the board to create his swirling backgrounds. These were then worked up by Blake into the final image using pen and ink. And both Blake's and Ernst's art show the incredible capabilities of this artistic technique. Among the English Surrealists, Blake was unsurprisingly evoked more widely. One significant example of this was Paul Nash, a painter, printmaker, designer, writer and photographer. He studied briefly at the Slade but was essentially self-taught. After his first one-man show at the Carfax Gallery in London, Nash served as an officer during the First World War before becoming official war artist in 1917. His Void of War exhibition in 1918 established his reputation, but his real period of innovation began in the late 1920s. Nash can be seen as belonging to a tradition of English art that includes Blake, Samuel Palmer and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He was very explicit about the importance of Blake to him, as for example in a letter to Dora Carrington in 1913, in which he remarked, "I expect you love Blake as I do." Early drawings such as Angel and Devil were directly inspired by Blake, and in the 1940s he made a final series of sunflower paintings inspired by Blake's poem Our Sunflower. Nash extended Blake's influence in a new direction, creating a series of visionary landscapes. In an article for the Listener in 1932 he wrote, "Perhaps the strangest contribution to the history of the pictorial subject in England, and one whose character is, in a sense, extremely modern, was made by William Blake. Blake is said to have hated nature, and his work certainly shows a contempt for natural appearances. Like the Surrealists of today, he sought material for his pictures in other worlds. Within the realm of the mind, he conceived certain very precise and solid images, bright with colour and of a rather persistent curvilinear design. The finest of these do indeed burn with unreal life and seem the product of unique vision. Nash's friend Leonard Robinson said that his interest in Blake waned during the middle period of his artistic life, but that increased once more prior to his death in 1946. As he was working on beautiful images such as Eclipse of the Sunflower in 1945, it seemed true that Blake now constantly engaged his mind. Nash was one of a number of English neo-romantics such as Graham Sutherland and John Craxton, who were greatly influenced by Blake and many of the Shoreham ancients who befriended Blake towards the end of his life, most notably Samuel Palmer. This preserved a perspective in visionary art that persisted in the 19th century despite the trend towards academic realism. Among the Surrealists, a very different perspective on Blakean energy came from the philosopher and author Georges Bataille. Bataille was founder of the literary review Critique, and his view of Blake was profoundly different to that of Breton. While it is difficult to summarise Bataille's ideas, one approach may be drawn from his work The Accursed Share, published posthumously in 1967. Bataille draws principally upon Nietzsche and the Marquis de Sade, supported by Freud and Marx, to describe a theory of human sovereignty. For him, while man may try to deny his animality, to gain true freedom we must accept that the sacred is in fact that which is prohibited, cast out from mundane daily life. Blake has a significant role to play in Bataille's theories. In Blake's emphasis on oppositions, the notion that without contraries is no true progression, this becomes extremely important for the later writer. The Accursed Share takes its opening quote from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell: "Exuberance is beauty." Blake also provides the central image for a theory of excess, that the sexual act is in time what the tiger is in space. In his collection of essays, Literature and Evil, published in 1957, Bataille opposed Sartre's view of literature as a moral act of political commitment. Instead, he argued for the hypermorality of literature. As evil has a sovereign value for us, argues Bataille, literature should not shrink from communicating that evil to us, but rather engage in a rigorous morality that results from the knowledge of evil and is expressed in intense communication, as found in the greatest art. Bataille discussed such writers as Kafka, de Sade, Emily Bronte and Baudelaire, as well as Blake. His reading of Blake as a sovereign visionary of evil is a position that he shares with Algernon Swinburne in the 19th century. For Bataille, Blake is, along with John Ford and Emily Bronte, the most moving of English writers, in the excessive violence of whose work evil attains a form of purity. For him, as for the other Surrealists, Blake epitomises the total artist, one whose life and art were uncompromised. The principal appeal of Blake's art, particularly his poetry for Bataille, is that it refuses to enslave us in a world of things, but insists instead upon its own sovereignty. It is in this realm of the sacred that Blake's special relationship to sovereign evil emerges, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, unsurprisingly, being an important book to Bataille. To alienated modern man who values accumulation and profit above all things, the prosperity of the gift, of waste and consumption, of squander, is forever denied as a sovereign activity. In Blake, however, Bataille recognised an energy that propelled the artist to a peak of disorder from which he saw in its integrity and violence the extent of the instinct which propels us towards the worst, but at the same time raises us to good. For Bataille, then, Blake was a master of paradox, or, as he wrote in The Marriage, "Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active springing from energy. Energy is eternal delight." The last of the Surrealists I would like to touch upon here, who was deeply influenced by Blake, was Philippe Soupault. Born in 1827, Soupault was active in the Dada movement before going on to found Surrealism with André Breton following the First World War. In 1927, he translated Blake's Songs of Innocence and of Experience into French with his wife, Marie-Louise, and the following year wrote a monograph on the English poet that was translated by J. Lewis May and published in the same year by The Bodley Head. There was never a man who's more thoroughly merited the title of genius than his poet-engraver, whose sole ambition was to be himself, and that to the fullest degree possible. With this statement, he captures the sentiment of the Surrealists, but also modernists more generally when considering Blake. That the earlier romantic was a complete artist, one who created his art not with an eye on any wider public, but following his own desires and visions. The biography of Blake that he provides is brief, running to little more than 50 pages and highly derivative, drawing mainly on the account provided by Blake's most famous biographer, Alexander Gilchrist, and possibly the work of W.B. Yeats, who had published widely on Blake at the turn of the century. Its significance, however, was to introduce Blake to a wider French audience and to consolidate his position as a precursor to the Surrealists in particular, and modernism more generally. In this, Blake also probably offered some hope to those ambitious artists who found the general public hostile to their experiments. As Soupault remarked, he never succeeded in interesting himself in the world about him. He also saw in Blake an opportunity to demonstrate the power of the new art that was transforming Europe after the devastation of the Great War. We are, he writes, in danger of committing a still more egregious error if we prefer dissecting a picture by Blake to experiencing the emotion, the shock of wonder to which the contemplation of it gives rise within us. Above that general average of performance, which we may call everyday art, workaday art, some painters arise and stir up in us a belief in the supremacy of certain modes of expression, and we forget then that such artists are the exception and not the rule. The shock and wonder of art was very much something which Soupault and his contemporaries such as Max Ernst and André Breton hoped to achieve with Surrealism. The everyday art of the Academy had not saved the world from the horrors of war. That, they felt, would be the task of the young men of a new age who would call upon painting, poetry, sculpture and architecture to try and create a better world.